Solving linear equations. To solve linear equations, we perform inverse operations to both sides of the equation to keep the equation balanced. So what do we mean by that? Well, if our operation is adding, the inverse operation is subtracting. And of course that works both ways round. If the operation is subtracting, the inverse is adding. So the same is true for multiplying and dividing. And of course, there are other things that you can do to both sides of an equation, such as squaring or square rooting. So what about the steps for solving linear equations? Well, the first one listed here is expand any brackets. Now note you don't, strictly speaking, have to do that. Suppose I had something like 2x plus 3 equals 6. I could, rather than expand the brackets here, just divide both sides by 2 and I'd get x plus 3 equals 3. But generally speaking, the thing on this side won't be divisible by this number. And if it isn't, you end up working with fractions, potentially over a number of steps, and that can be difficult. So as a rule of thumb, expanding brackets is not a bad first step. We're then asked to simplify. What do we mean by that? Well, let's suppose we had that 2x plus 3, but also on this side we had x. When you expand out, you're going to get this, and then you should put the x's together. Gather the variables on one side of the equation, and it says here on the side where there are the most. So what we're talking about there is if we had, say, 5x plus 4, and then we had 2x minus 3 or something, then there are more x's on this side. So gather the x's up on the left-hand side and do that by subtracting 2x from both sides. And then 3x plus 4 here, and if we subtracted 2x from over here, you just end up with the negative 3. It's best to identify the side where there are most x's, because that way we end up working with a positive number of x's. And once you've done that, you want to put all the constants on the opposite side. So in other words, this 4 is going to need to go over there. Perform the inverse operation to get the variable by itself. So remember, the answer is always x equals, not 2x equals, or 3x equals, or x plus 5 equals. When you have solved the equation, you have found what is known as the root of the equation. So if you're ever asked to find a root or roots of an equation, remember what you're doing is solving it. Don't forget that answers do not have to be whole numbers. If you end up with an answer that isn't a whole, it can be written as a fraction, and that's often the best way to do it rather than a decimal, because a fraction in many instances is more accurate. You must always simplify your fractions to achieve full marks. That's a rule of thumb. It may not happen in every instance.